About to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be, life with no distractions. We'll get away, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's go. Let's be free with me. Be free. Not looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free.
Hi there, and good evening, and welcome to our latest live stream for A-Level Politics. I'm joined as ever by Kira. Hi, Kira.
Hello.
And we've got half an hour or so today about Parliament and looking at the effectiveness of Parliament. Now, quite a few people today, particularly teachers, but some of the students as well, will have been poring over the advance information that has come out from the exam boards today. And it does look like you probably will get a question on Parliament. We don't know what aspect of Parliament come the summer. So this will be very good use. And I've also seen that someone in the chat window has got a test on this on Thursday. So hopefully we can assist with that as well. So we'll get cracking. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you're watching us live, and it's great to see some of you watching us live today, this evening, you can join in with the activities by typing into the chat window, and we'd love to see your thoughts, and we can read those as well and interact with them. If you are watching on catch up, which we also know that very many more of you do each week, you can't engage in the live chat window, but you get the advantage possibly of pausing the video, getting a little bit longer on some of the activities and that kind of thing. Okay, let's crack straight on without further ado to the presentation, and we're going to start with an activity called the Application Gallery. So what you're going to see on the screen in a moment are some pictures, and I just want you to have a think about what those pictures might conjure up in terms of issues to do with Parliament, Parliament's effectiveness, Parliament's functions, role. So let's have a look at them. You'll see what I mean when they come up. There are going to be 3 pictures, and I want you to, essentially freestyle in the live chat window with applying some politics to those pictures. Okay, so we've got 3 pictures here, and you can put the number 1, 2, or 3 next to your suggestions, your thoughts. So we recognise who that is on picture number 1, but just in case you didn't, there's a little there's a little label in the left hand corner, although it seems to be on Dominic Raab's head, so that's just to cause confusion. And then we've got a photograph of some people, lots of people. Don't know if they've all got something in common. You can have a look, and also some lords there on the last picture. So I'm going to set the timer going, the clock going, and you type in if you can think of anything relating to the functions of Parliament, the role of Parliament, the effectiveness of Parliament, either it being effective or it not being effective, perhaps, that relate to those pictures. Okay, and some are coming in already. And I do like the music for this one. The latest Netflix drama. Murder in the Commons. Feels like a crime drama. So we've got a suggestion in the chat window. Number 1 could relate to the executive. It could. In relation to the Parliament, what could that be? Perhaps Parliament holding the government to the executive to account or not doing. 2, representation. Representation of who, perhaps? Are some groups being represented there, or indeed not being represented there in that picture? 2 and 3 could relate to scrutiny, according to Anna, and another suggestion for scrutiny for 3. Are we suggesting they are scrutinising or sleeping in that picture? It's not entirely easy to see.
I don't know. They can do it in their sleep, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's such good scrutineers that they can do it in a kind of dreamland. Okay, so some good ideas coming through there. I had some. I think mine are all totally different, but it's fine. That's always good. We could have a bit of a discussion. So first one, holding the Prime Minister to account, for example, something like Prime Minister's questions. We don't know if that's during Prime Minister's questions. It looks like it could be, doesn't it? Because the House is quite full, either Prime Minister's questions or perhaps the Prime Minister making a statement. Scrutiny of the government, scrutiny of the executive, possibly executive dominance. There are quite a few things you could talk about there. He looks a little perplexed on that picture. It might be that he is being scrutinised there or held to account, potentially. He might be after being asked a difficult question or not very happy about something. With number 2, the thing that came to my mind was the increased representation of women. I'm not 100% sure when that picture's from. It's not the current...
it looks like Blair's Babes.
It could be Blair's Babes era. I'm looking at who some of the people are in there. There's Emily Thornberry, Margaret Beckett. I think it might be slightly more recent than Blair's Babes, but a lot older than the current the current women in the PLP. Because actually, one thing I noticed on that picture, which would be different if we were looking at the current Parliamentary Labour Party women, is that it does look like a very white group of women. I mean, there are obviously a few people missing because if, say, that's 2010 or something like that, there would have been Diane Abbott, for example, a few other people there who don't seem to be on the picture. But today there is more representation of minority ethnic women in the Parliament as well as in. But so we could have looked at either of those aspects really, or a few different aspects of representation there, representation of social groups. I mean, you could talk about that in relation to 3 as well, couldn't you? Because we are looking at, I've said it's an unrepresentative Lords, because it's, I mean, there is actually a woman in the bottom right-hand corner in there. I was thinking it was a picture of three very old men, but there is a woman there. So, but even so, only 25% of that particular picture, although that is more representative of women than the actual Lords. But I think, but it's so you could take that bit. we could question the effectiveness of the Lords on that particular picture. Actually, sometimes it looks like they're asleep and they've got those speakers in the chair. If you can see, there's every sort of 2 buttons, there's like a little speaker, and so sometimes people are holding their ear back to the speaker so they can hear someone talking, and it looks like they're asleep. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Although sometimes they might. Sometimes they may actually be asleep. But yeah, people have raised that scrutiny. That's one of the roles of the Lords, isn't it? And, we could think about, the Lords. I've kind of suggested maybe that's the Lords not being very effective, but of course we could think about ways in which the Lords also are effective as a house that scrutinises and amends and all those sorts of things, and that you have experts and things in there. Okay, so that's just to get us started, really, and we've got another sort of starter activity now from Kira, thinking about some of the functions of Parliament.
Cool, thank you. So yeah, what I want us to think about then is there are a few functions of Parliament. So about 4 functions, but I'll split it into 5 here. And I want to think about kind of out of this list, which of these ones on this list, which 5 things on this list would represent the functions of Parliament. So just drop down any ones in the chat. I've deliberately put some in to kind of throw you off a little bit. So just kind of think about it carefully. So when we're talking about the functions of Parliament, we mean what is it that Parliament's supposed to do? And I think by thinking of what Parliament's supposed to do, we can then evaluate if it's actually effective in fulfilling those roles. So just put down in the chat out of this list which ones are ones which represent, which are about the functions of Parliament.
We don't have a timer or music for this one, so just see how you go on.
Maybe I'll just start singing.
Could do. I've got a guitar here, actually. I could.
Yeah, maybe. Choose a few bands.
There's at least one of these I think slightly controversial, or we could have a bit of a debate about whether Parliament is, whether it's meant to do it or whether it does it on a very small scale.
Actually, there's one in particular that Parliament is increasingly doing, actually, with the Backbench Business Committee. So we're seeing that shift from the executive to Parliament. So any ideas, like what is it that Parliament's kind of supposed to do, its functions?
Anna's come through with a few there.
Okay, good. Excellent. Okay, there's one that's not right there. Oh, and the second person's also made the mistake too. So think about it. Does Parliament propose legislation?
I have to say this is my controversial one, because of course there are sort of private members' bills and 10-minute rule bills and things like that. I mean, they very rarely, if ever, become law.
Like the upskirting bill, when that tried to come through Parliament, and the MP refused on the principle that Parliament shouldn't propose legislation, which was great for women.
Yes, I mean you get those MPs, particularly there's a few Conservative MPs who will always kind of talk out these private members' bills on that for that reason. It's there's a chap in Shipley, Philip Davis, who will I think that's Nadine Dorris's partner, isn't it? I think anyway, it does a random fact of the day, but I'm having a moment forgetting the word. What's the word where they keep talking until time runs out? It's
filibuster.
Filibuster, yes. He will perform a filibuster on a Friday when they're debating these things and stop them.
Which was with the upskirting bill. They put it at the end of the timetable because they just thought it was going to pass, because it's a no-brainer, right? People shouldn't be able to take photos up a woman's skirt or a person's skirt, and so because it was at the end, they didn't have time for the discussion to go forward, and he shut it down. But then it did get passed by the government.
Yes, okay, that's often what happens. Shall we have a look?
Yeah, let's put the answers there. So collective responsibility isn't one, because it's important for Parliament to be able to scrutinise. Technically, the government's backbenchers should be allowed to scrutinise the government, and this is when the limits come in, right? Because Parliament is so dominated by the executive, in the sense that you have party whips and things like that. So it means that backbenchers won't necessarily scrutinise the government. So they don't have to follow collective responsibility. That's one of the cabinet's roles, to follow collective responsibility, to agree with everything in public and not question the executive. But in practice, we don't often see backbench Tories, for example, criticising the Conservative Party. Although obviously with the kind of recent events with Boris Johnson, we're seeing more outspoken Conservatives than before. So that is a function of cabinet. Scrutinising governments, are asking them questions, holding them to account. And the role of Parliament's not to propose legislation, even though there are a few days a year where they can now because of reforms to the House of Commons. Most of the time, they actually just debate, discuss, and amend bills. So that's where the power of the executive comes in, because they get to propose what's discussed, right? They get to propose the laws that are put forward the vast majority of the time. And then obviously after that debate process, after we go through the legislative process, that's when the voting on the bills happens. And if it passes through Parliament, which it often does because of government majorities, it becomes an act. One that's interesting is the recruitment of ministers too. So effectively, what happens is those MPs who are backbenchers, who don't hold a government position, they learn about the way that Parliament works and laws are made.
Oh, sorry. I pressed the wrong button. Sorry.
Oh wow!
Cheers.
Got, like,
round of applause for the.
everyone was so excited about recruiting ministers. Yeah. Yeah. So that's obviously quite an important role, learning about the job, on the job kind of thing. And of course, representation is one that is their role, but obviously there's three parts to that, right? That you can think about it demographically, like, for example, about 51% of the population are women, but only 32% of MPs are women. So they're not doing too well there. Not to mention BME, LGBT, things like that. Or is it that they should represent their party or their constituency, or, of course, just themselves as experts in the Burkean model as well? So quite a lot to kind of think about there, and think, how effective are they at each of these sort of thing?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I think it's over to
Great
you.
stuff. Okay, so I'm going to do a little bit of sort of application now, really. We're going to look at some of these kind of Parliament either being effective or not in certain ways. I'd like you to think of an example. Now, that could be like a general example of how Parliament does or doesn't do this, or it can be a specific example if you want to give us an actual topical example of perhaps, doesn't have to be recent. It could be a classic, either a recent or a classic example of it actually happening. So I'll show you what I mean. So we've got the effectiveness of Parliament, and then round the side we've got maybe the effectiveness of scrutinising legislation, changing legislation, representing constituents, being representative of the UK population, which I think is slightly different from representing constituents, holding the government to account, or scrutinising the work of government departments. Now we'll spin the wheel a couple of times, so we'll look at probably two of these, but we don't know where it's going to stop. It's like Michael McIntyre on a Saturday night. There's a bit of jeopardy here. Where's it going to stop? But when it does stop, I want you to try and think of an example of Parliament being effective or not doing this thing. Okay, here we go. All right, representing constituents. So how does Parliament, in this case we're talking about MPs in the Commons, aren't we? Because of course the Lords don't represent constituents at all. How do they represent their constituents, and can you think of examples of them doing this? You can have a minute to have a think about this. I'm quite pleased I found my applause button again. I was trying to find my mute button, but instead I found my applause button, which is always fun.
I mean, useful button to have.
Yeah, if someone comes up with a really good example in here, I'll give them a round of applause. I mean, just in general, before you come up with like a specific example, or you don't have to come up with a specific example, what sort of things do they do in order to represent their constituents? You know, how do MPs carry out that function? So they're given an opportunity to give questions they have on behalf of constituents at PMQs. Yeah, absolutely. They might raise constituency issues at PMQs. If you ever watch that, they'll often, once you've had sort of Keir Starmer's 6 questions and the SNP guy gets chucked out, you then get you get people saying, asking about, a factory in their constituency or an issue that someone in their constituency has, asking the Prime Minister to visit, that kind of thing. Absolutely, Anna's saying the same. MPs raising their constituents' concerns in PMQs. For example, recent complaints about HS2. Very good. Yeah, so that's their kind of thing, isn't it? There's other stuff too, but that's a really good example. They can raise issues on the floor and Prime Minister's questions and other ministers' questions, of course. It won't always be questions to the Prime Minister. It might be a question to a specific minister. I've also mentioned their MPs holding regular surgeries in their constituencies, so they find out, where do they find out about these concerns? They get a lot of letters. That's a big part, but they also hold regular surgeries and meet constituents in order to try and represent their constituents. Well done. Let's have a look at another area. So we're going to spin the wheel again. Right, there we go. Holding the government to account. Can we think of an example of Parliament either effectively or ineffectively holding the government to account, or trying to? Might be some very recent examples, potentially.
Well, Parliament's trying to. Let's see. Let's see what happens, right?
Yeah.
Or is it an elective dictatorship anyway? Parliament.
But, yeah.
Probably.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because there's a limit to what Parliament do. We're all sort of waiting for Conservative MPs to do something, aren't they? So, we've got the investigation of Boris Johnson from the Met. Well, yeah, but that's being held to account by the police rather than by Parliament. Yeah, votes of no confidence, Deirdre's mentioned. Yeah, absolutely. So, and backbench rebellions, brilliant. It's an interesting one with the votes of no confidence. Of course, at the moment there's talk about a potential vote of no confidence in Boris Johnson, but that's within the Conservative Party. So it is within Parliament, but it's within the Parliamentary Conservative Party. It's within the 1922 committee and things like that. There is also, you're right, absolutely right, the whole House could hold a vote of no confidence in the government. It's very unlikely they will, and very unlikely they'd win one, because of course the government has a big majority, even if MPs are currently unhappy with the Prime Minister. They're unlikely to vote to essentially hold a general election or to potentially lose their seat. So you're much more likely to see a vote of no confidence within the party than a full parliamentary one. But there were, if we think back before the 2019 general election, there was quite a bit of talk then about a potential vote of no confidence in the government, wasn't there, over Brexit and things like that. So these things can happen. And it is definitely
Boris Johnson trying to force it from Jeremy Corbyn because he wanted an election, but he was held back by the Fixed Term Parliament Act.
Yeah, absolutely.
Breathe him into it. It was interesting watching, wasn't it?
It was. It was a fascinating sort of period, really. They were sort of kind of trying to goad people into holding a motion of no confidence. Quite interesting. Because there was a sort of stalemate over Brexit at the time. I nearly said breakfast. I think about sort of 20% of the time I try to say Brexit, I say breakfast. Anyway. Okay, so that's, well done. Came up with some good ideas there. I mentioned sort of oral and written questions. And in terms of kind of questions, from the opposition parties, for example, we've had stuff recently about Partygate, haven't we? Prime Minister being put under quite a bit of pressure in Parliament. I mean, you can say, well, how effective is it? Because, I'm sure some of those question sessions weren't particularly comfortable for the Prime Minister, but, as yet, as of the time of broadcast, he's still in position. So, interesting to see how effective it is. Okay, I'm going to hand back to Kira now for the Evaluwheel.
Well, thank you. So yeah, obviously AO3 of the exam involves being able to evaluate, but that's obviously doesn't mean that you're just on the fence, but it's about kind of, are you able to put forward both sides of the argument before coming to your overall judgment? So the wheel's going to select essentially the kind of connective word for this, for what we're going to do with the rest of this argument. So the argument that's put forward is Parliament is effective in fulfilling its functions of representation. So we can see that's a criteria. So we're talking in this paragraph then about representation to assess the functions. So it's effective in fulfilling its function of representation as MPs can vote down proposed legislation which undermines the needs of their constituents. So there we've got our argument. So let's see what we have to do with the next bit. So the first argument is that MPs can vote down legislation. So, okay, now we need to think about the counter argument then. So, however, so Parliament's effective because it can vote down proposed legislation. But what about a counter argument to that? To what extent actually can Parliament even block legislation? Do they have the powers to do that? So, just put down some ideas in the chat.
And when they do vote down proposed legislation, I wonder how high up the list of pressures on them representing their constituents actually is.
Yeah, and a good
Even
example.
if they're voting against, it may well be that their main function is party discipline or whatever, rather than.
Yeah, exactly. So Anna said here that the government has a majority and MPs are most often abide by their party whips. Brilliant. That's cool. I like it. It works. Yeah, excellent. Completely true, right? So the fact that the party has its parliamentary whip, so people like Gavin Williamson, who used to have a tarantula on his desk to threaten people to vote how he wanted them to vote, does kind of make it and reduce Parliament or the House Commons and MPs down to lobby fodder, right? They just vote as their party tells them to and don't think about anything else, as Disraeli famously said. And then we've got with a majority government, it is very difficult for the opposition to block or pass bills. Fantastic, yeah. So the opposition don't really hold much power, which reinforces why those whips are so important, right? So because the whips will control the majority of MPs, they can force legislation through. I was going to say a good example actually for the fact that they can vote for the needs of their constituents. So sometimes MPs can vote for that. And we saw in 2016 in Brent Central, Dawn Butler held an emergency constituency meeting after the Brexit referendum, and Brent Central was a Remain constituency, sorry. And she asked her constituents, "How do you want me to vote? Do you want me to break the Labour Party's 3-line whip?" And the constituents said, yes, you should break the whip. You need to vote to not honour the referendum. Not trigger Article 50. And so she went with her constituents and she lost her position in the shadow cabinet as a result. And that kind of shows that actually there was a consequence for her actions there. And it's about, if she wants to think about her career in the Labour Party, she maybe might have kind of sabotaged that under Corbyn, although it didn't really work out like that for her anyway. But so, yes. The PM uses whips to enforce party loyalty, so they reducing MPs down to lobby fodder.
And the opposition do too, of course, not just the.
Yeah, of course the opposition do too, because they're thinking about getting elected, right? Which is why Corbyn enforced people to vote for Article 50. And patronage limits their freedom as they are conscious of career. So they listen to the whips because they're worried that if they don't, they will sabotage their future of being in the cabinet in that party too. Because obviously, prime ministers and cabinet members will remember if you're somebody who doesn't follow the party line as well. So, yeah, really good answers, guys. Okay, so let's do another one. So the argument here then, so this is another criteria. So Parliament is effective in fulfilling its function of scrutiny. As select committees hold the government to account. So we've got functional scrutiny, that's our criteria, and our argument is that select committees are effective in holding the government to account. So let's see what we have to do. Do we agree with this one? Okay, cool. So another, however, so another argument and counter argument. Okay, so what counter arguments can you think for select committees being effective in scrutinizing the government? Obviously, really important role, right? Looking over things like legislation, government action. So things like the liaison committee, which is the committee that actually scrutinizes the prime minister directly, even though he didn't see them for a long time, even though he was summoned. But that's just,
And yeah, so there's lots of things you could say on the, to support that point, aren't there? You can give examples of select committees, performing that function quite effectively. But yeah, I want some counter arguments.
And yeah, this the select committee's powers to call in experts, to call for papers, is quite useful, right? For looking over legislation before and after it's passed.
Yeah. Although it's interesting to point out that although it has the power to call for them, it doesn't have the legal power of summons. So it's not like a court, and so if they ask people to appear, they can say no, and have done.
Yeah.
Although government ministers would tend not to, because it obviously doesn't look great if you, if you, and the committee chair, and there'll be members of your party on the committee who will be cross if you.
Basically, British democracy, we do it because it doesn't look great. So
Yeah.
we lose an election because it doesn't look great. The joys of an uncodified constitution. But yeah, okay, let's see some arguments against select committees being effective then. So I think a good phrase that I've heard a lot about select committees is this idea that they're toothless watchdogs. So they're watchdogs, so they're guardians of democracy, making sure that executives are actually the executive, sorry, is in line with democratic ideas. It's not going beyond its role and things like that. But actually, it's limited because just like the House of Commons is supposed to be a guardian of democracy, its composition in the House of Commons, the fact that they're majority, the party of the executive, limits them. And it's not actually any different with select committees. So the composition of select committees reflects the House of Commons as well. So if the governing party has a majority of 60% in the House of Commons, their select committee will have a majority of 60% as well, which is quite limited. Although the right reforms have been quite important, because it's basically made it so that instead of it being the executive appointing the members of the select committee, so those people are more friendly and things like that, they are actually independently selected now from separate from the government, and that's quite an important change. Although, again, if you care about your career, you're not going to criticize the prime minister too much. And then the other thing is that they cannot enforce; they can only recommend. So they can kind of say, well, this maybe is a bad idea. You should probably think about changing that. The executive actually does have the ability to just ignore them as well. And that's because Parliament is sovereign, the executive dominates Parliament. So they have the right to basically just ignore recommendations from select committees, but also from the Supreme Court too.
It's also, in terms of the select committees, they tend to try and get a consensus, don't they? And because you've got opposition and government people on there, they tend to be reasonably bland reports in the end because they're trying to get everyone to agree to it. So yeah. So even if they're agreed to. Okay. Stepping stones.
Yeah, so this one is about trying to think about like a chain of analysis. So let's think about a cause and effect sort of thing. So it's kind of more or less filling in the gaps for this paragraph. So if we start off with this idea that the House of Lords is not an effective check to government power, so thinking about effectively the balance of power between the House of Lords and the House of Commons, the comparative powers. So the House of Lords is not an effective check to government power. This is because the Lords lacks democratic legitimacy. What could we potentially say before we got to that conclusion? So what points of analysis could we make? So see if you could put down any ideas in the chat. So it's not an effective check to government power because it lacks democratic legitimacy. So how? Maybe try and think about what you can say.
Important point. If you get an essay question about Parliament that doesn't specify which House of Parliament, you should try and talk about both the Commons and the Lords.
Yeah, that's a very common mistake. Yeah. Excellent. Lords are not elected. Perfect. Yeah, so the House of Commons are able to shoot down legislation because they are directly elected by the public. Excellent. They can only amend and make suggestions. Perfect. So they effectively only delay legislation. They cannot veto it because they don't have democratic legitimacy. It's a really important point. Yeah. So they're able to scrutinize legislation, but again, it's only to the point where they can kind of just publicly criticize it. But the power is restricted to only delay and recommending amendments. So that's a really good point. So basically, what Anna said as well. Perfect. Cool. So over to you for your is this your language lessons or
So our final activity today, just some key terms relating to functions and effectiveness of Parliament. So do see how you get on with this. We've got some key terms. We've mixed all the vowels up, so they end up looking like very strange words in a very strange language. Can you work out what they are? And as an added dimension, perhaps define them. Okay, I'll explain what they mean if where we feel we need to. Okay, so I don't know who Rupert Stogu is. Any idea what key term relating to Parliament could be there if we mixed up the vowels? Put some different vowels in. All the consonants are right and in the right order. It's just the vowels that are wrong. Rupert Stogu. He's not some obscure constitutional expert who... it's not a person at all. I've seen someone come through on the chat window with the correct answer. It is indeed the report stage. So it's one of our stages of legislation that comes after the committee stage, when the public bill committees report back to the Commons during the process of legislation. Well done, Mr. W. Okay, next one. This is not the Welsh Assembly. Matan Avna Canfadonco. I always like to try and pronounce them. I do apologise. So, Matan Avna Canfadonco. Any ideas? It has come up already today, actually.
I'm so bad at these. I can never actually work them out.
Well, this one just seems to have changed everything to an A, which doesn't help really. Not nearly. Well done, Anna. It is indeed a motion of no confidence. Very good. And we've already talked about those. Next one, Shart Manny.
Oh, I actually worked this one out. Yeah.
Shart Manny. Any ideas?
This is supposed to make scrutiny more fair, right?
Yeah. Evens things up a little bit.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Yes. Well done, Harry.
Oh, well done. Yeah, it is indeed short money. So that's money that, and Anna's got it as well, money that goes to the opposition to help pay for working of the opposition, to compensate to a certain degree behind the sort of inbuilt advantage that the Treasury benches, the government, have by having the full weight of the civil service behind them, which obviously assists their sort of the executive dominance in Parliament, if you like. Salisbury Kinvuntuin. Yeah, well done, Anna. Got that one quite quickly. Salisbury Convention. What is the Salisbury Convention? Harry's got it as well. Anyone want to quickly remind us what the Salisbury Convention is? Mr. W's got it too. I'll move on to the next one while someone types in their definition of the or explanation of the Salisbury Convention. But it's a useful one to think about in terms of particularly the effectiveness of the Lords, House of Lords, and what the House of Lords is or able to do. Yet can't block things that are in the party manifesto. Yeah. It's an interesting one because, I mean, there've been a couple of recent stories of where the Lords have blocked things that sort of were in the manifesto. Yeah, how strictly you define this. Yes, there was some that you shouldn't. Yeah, interesting clarification there. Because
it's the policing bill, right? Is the thing
Yeah.
that's calling into question, because they said they were going to give the police more powers and solve the issues of protesters' nuisance or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's interesting.
Because obviously manifestos are never very specific, so they wouldn't say precise details of the legislation. So there is that grey area, isn't there? Really, is where did the manifesto, was that, is what the policing bill has turned out to be quite what the manifesto was suggesting it would be? I mean, that was interesting one. And you were right, it was the Salisbury Convention, and the final one, Parliamentary Provolugu. I think the first word's sorry. So the first word's pretty straightforward, I think, isn't it?
This one upset Philip Green, right, with the issue of buying BHS and not paying for pensions.
Yeah. All right, we've got the answer in the chat window. A few people have got it. Parliamentary privilege, very good, well done. Shout out to you. I'll give you a quick round of applause. What is parliamentary privilege? What does it mean? I mean, it relates to a few different aspects of kind of the rights of an MP, but it's sort of one area we particularly tend to refer to it in relation to. Anyone gonna type anything in the chat window before I just start?
Of course, actually, yeah, Deirdre, good point.
Yes. Yeah, that is an interesting point. Yeah.
I never thought about that actually, but yeah, he got away with saying something very incorrect.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. So, and obviously we can't really repeat it because we don't have parliamentary privilege. But obviously we can say what was said. So there's one particular aspect of parliamentary privilege is that MPs are free to speak without fear of the courts. So and so there have been quite a few cases over the years of MPs revealing things that they wouldn't have been able to reveal on television or in newspapers, or indeed saying things that were untrue, which is the one that Deirdre's referring to. That isn't the sort of point of parliamentary privilege, isn't to allow people to make stuff up about people, but so it allows MPs to speak freely without fear of persecution. Very good there in the chat window, well done. So I think that's our last one. Just a quick reminder, if you've got a smart device, you can scan that QR code there, and we've got all sorts of study notes and videos and all sorts on there. If you go to tutortube.net/live, we've done loads of these since last sort of about a year ago, over the last 12 months, revision sessions and sessions on ideologies all the way through last term. So do go along and see those. You might not bother with the liberalism ones this year, who knows? but you may well look at most of the rest. And we've got some resources there as well that are available if you want them. Okay, so I'm going to go back to TutorTube HQ. There we are, and some really good contributions in the chat window this evening, weren't there, Kira?
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Thanks, guys. It's always good to see your answers.
And we've come in pretty much on time, so that's good. I'm now going to dash straight off to GCSE sociology, so I'm going to sign off. But it's great to speak to you all this evening, and we shall see you next week. Do we know what we're doing next week? We may revisit our topics in the light of the advance information that's come out. So you will find out nearer the time. But we were discussing earlier possibly something about devolution. So we might look at devolution next time. Okay. See you guys. Very nice to chat to you this evening. See you next time. Bye bye.
Cool, guys. Good luck in your test tomorrow as well.
Oh yeah.